We have another lecture today titled Changing Urban Landscapes, Poverty and Education, a perspective from the margins of Delhi, delivered by Professor Geetha B. Nambissan, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. In this context, friends, I request my colleague, my friend, Dr. Mosam Trivedi, to introduce the speaker.
Good afternoon, one and all. I am Mosam Trivedi from South Gujarat University. So, respected today's our guest speaker, Geetha ma'am, and our RC convener, Professor Mohammed sir, and all participants who are joining from all over India. I welcome you all. Today is our fifth lecture, special lecture of Sociology of Education. In this series, we to understand the different aspect of sociology of educations, and on this subject today we get an opportunity to hear from Professor Dr. Geetha Nambissan. So we welcome you, ma'am. I'm just trying to briefly introduce, but there is no words describe your work on sociology of educations. Geetha ma'am has very well known in the field of sociology of education. She was working as a professor at Zakir Hussain Center of Educational Study at JNU. Her research focus on exclusion, inclusion, and equity in education of the marginalized group of the different section of the societies, like Dalit, girls, tribals, and other minorities. She is also raised a question on private education system as development sector of the business. She also done her PhD in sociology of education from the JNU. In this subject, she write so many number of books on this subject. The particular 1 and 2 are like Sociology of Education in India, Education and Social Justice in the Era of Globalization, Child Labor and the Right to Education in South Asia. There were her very famous books. Right now, she serves as the adjunct fellow of Institute of Chinese Study. So she is still working, and we are very happy to hear from you, ma'am. So we enlightened by your thoughts. Thank you. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. I am very grateful to Professor Mohammed, PH Mohammed, from the Department of Sociology, Manu, Maulana Azad Urdu National University, and Professor Maitri Chaudhary, who's president of the Indian Sociological Association, for asking me to give this lecture. This, as you can see from the title, I mean, it's about changing urban and education. This is part of a study that I and about 4 of us are doing. We belong to different institutions. It's a kind of an international kind of project. It's anchored by the Max Weber. It's called Education and the Changing Urban in India. It's anchored by the Max Weber German Historical Institute, London, and the Max Weber Stiftung, its branch office in India. And we have actually looked at this very important theme, which is not really studied too much. There are a lot of studies on schooling and education in the city, but really look at what urban transformations does to children's education, and is something that is important to look at, and to look at the kinds of, what does it mean for as far as social justice is concerned. In this presentation, I want to emphasize that space also matters, and there is something called spatial justice, which is something that we need to take into account even as we are looking at social it's class, caste, gender, etc. Space also matters. So I'm just putting up the, yeah, so this is the, what I'm trying to do. I will briefly try to run through. Professor Mohammed says I have around 40 minutes. So let me just, so that's my title. So basically, we're looking at the interface between urban landscapes, poverty, and education. My focus is Delhi, the national capital of India, which is actually called a mega city because it has more than, these are the cities with more than 10 million population. I use the lens, it's a much larger study, but I'm just going to use the lens of what is called the Bhavana JJ resettlement colony. So this is a resettlement, I forgot to write resettlement, lens of a resettlement of poor and low-income families on Delhi's periphery. Resettlements are where those who lived in what are called slums, in inverted commas, bastis, jhuggi jhopris, when these are evicted, when they are evicted and there are new sites given for them to stay in Delhi, they're called resettlements. They may be called other things in other parts of the country. So I look at their journeys as poor rural migrants into the city since 1970s and 80s, and within it in search of livelihoods and aspirations for children's future and their interface with the changing city. This is not unique to Delhi. From wherever, whichever cities you are in, and if there's, especially post 2000, there's been a lot of change in many cities. Of course, some cities have really not changed much. So I show how Delhi's own journey to becoming a mega city in the 1990s, sorry, it's not 1980s, and its aspirations to become world-class post-2000 has led to increasing spatial inequalities and production of urban margins. The relegation of the poor to the urban margins has powerfully impacted their lives and the education of their children. So this is basically what I want to show. The study was carried out, it's a very small study, carried out in the Bhavana resettlement colony. These were families who formerly resided in a very large poor settlement, or as you call it, illegal settlement or basti in Delhi. That was called the Yamuna Pushta. And these are interviews with families, youth. Most of them are Dalit and Muslims who are in this resettlement. And I also spoke to some first generation college-going women in the colony. So I did some interviews in 2019, that is just prior to COVID, and a few, and I did some follow-up in 2021-22. So this is very briefly, all of you know that urban India, there's rapid growth of population, and urban spaces are diverse. If you look at the cities and many other urban spaces in India, there are a range of urban forms. You have the mega cities, smaller towns, middle towns, peripheral settlements, industrial towns, within city settlements and neighbors. So it is better to use the word urban rather than city per se. And what is important in all of these are, there are socio-spatial inequalities. You have exclusive gated communities, increasingly bounded colonies, unauthorized settlements, illegal slums and bastis. I normally don't like to use the word slums, but that's often the official thing given. So how do you really study the urban? So the urban is a socially structured spaces. They are not given, they are not natural, in the making. They are very fluid, and they are, especially post 2000 in India, but in other parts of the world, increasingly shaped by global capital with the neoliberal turn, but equally by the socio-historical context in which it has emerged. There is need to take a relational framework because you're looking at both privilege and disadvantage in the context of the changing urban. The socio-historical context is important, and in our study, we were very particular about looking both at socio-historical and contemporary. So historical context and the role of the state, institutional arrangements, which are set in place in the city, and the aspirations and agency of different sections of the population, not only the upper middle classes and upper classes, but the lower middle and the poorer sections also. It is important in relation to socio-spatial inequalities to focus on practices and mechanisms of exclusion, or what is called the field of exclusion and privilege and institutional practices. So that is really what one has to look at. If you're looking at urban margins, these are the socio-spatial peripheries which are produced by exclusionary practices of marginalization, including representation. They are often stigmatized. They are seen as not nice places to live in. They are on the spatial periphery. Space, as you know, has meanings. It becomes place with certain meanings. And there are socially valued spaces. There are stigmatized spaces. There are spoiled identities if you come from one of these spaces, according to Goffman, 1964, sorry, it's not 1984. And it's important. Basically your address matters. So that's what this means. One is taking a critical spatial perspective where the emphasis on spatial or geographical aspects of justice and injustice. That means geography matters, where you live matters. As a starting point, this involves the fair and equitable distribution in space of socially valued resources, in this case, education, and opportunities to use them. I won't elaborate on this, but there are a lot of urban scholars who feel that we need to look at India and South Asia a little differently. The production of the urban in these spaces is different from in the West. For instance, there's not this clear break between rural and urban. The way in which these slums and bastis come, so all of this is seen as something different. Now, India, in the post-independence, there is of course a history to every urban center, urban thing, but in the post-independence, there's been rapid growth of urban centers, but they have various trajectories because there is neglect of many smaller cities and towns. And state policy is, of course, important here in terms of how the development and neglect, capital, business, all of that is important. But the urban has been the site for economic betterment and social mobility. The metropolitan state capitals have been the destination for education, skilled professionals, and aspirations also for a dignified living for historical and marginal groups. If you remember Dr. Ambedkar, it was go to the city if you want to cut the kind of stigmatized caste identities that you have. For the urban story, for the poor has originated in rural India. Widespread poverty in the villages has seen rural migrants becoming a growing population of the city, with the demand for unskilled labor, because the city had to be built post-independence. But rather than giving them dwellings, they were forced to live in illegal settlements, often from one building site to another. Rural-urban interface, yes, there is a very clear, and we have seen this during COVID. But what is important is that the urban economy, there is increasingly casualization, contractualization. On the one hand, the slum clearance drives and beautification of the city, relegation to the spatial periphery as the city is beautified, made attractive to capital, and as gentrification takes place of earlier areas which were where the poor actually lived. There is formal and informal segregation in most cities. So this is it. Now, what about the change in urban and education? Now, globally, education is integral to the neoliberal agenda, and reforms in education are complicit in transformation of cities. Because with the urban restructuring, if you look at cities like London or Boston, New York, etc., there is the closure of schools, especially public schools, rebranding, privatization, commercialization. All of this is integral to making the city conducive to global capital and elite lifestyles. And we can see that in most of the metropolitan cities in India also. In the era of the welfare state, the first 3 decades, at least till the 70s, education was publicly funded, and there has been a network of publicly funded schools in cities, though, of course, this is pyramid shaped, quality varies, and so on. In that setting, in post-1990s, with globalization, privatization, neoliberal ideology, there's the rapid spread of markets and schooling in most cities in India. Studies on schooling have not been contextualized adequately within the changing landscape of the city, and urban studies rarely refer to children and their education. So this urban and education, interface is important. Schooling is shaped by spatial. So how is all this, how is education implicated in the changing urban, especially in relation to children's right to education? So schooling is shaped by spatial and institutional inequalities and policy shifts in the rapidly changing urban landscape in India, and this also varies in specific cities. At least till the 70s, 80s, the emphasis was more on urban-rural inequalities, but intra-urban inequalities were also quite high, mainly because the urban space is so, is uneven and is, you have different classes and communities living in the urban area. And increasingly, there has been the private government divide in the urban area, which also brings you a very stratified school system. But by the 2020s, if you look at gross enrollment ratios, you find that at least at elementary education, at least 100, secondary schooling maybe 90, and so that there has been some shift and some spread of schooling and access to schooling. Though, of course, if you look at it more deeply, the gross enrollment ratios are lower for Dalits, Adivasis, Muslims as compared to other communities, and especially at the secondary and higher secondary level. Okay, so this is something. So at a macro level, this is happening. I mean, you can see that the enrollments are rising. Okay, so the changing urban and so how do we look at urban spatial social justice and the space of education? So I argue that while there are structural inequalities and policy shifts have constrained the education, and in this case, I'm looking at the urban poor, their aspirations and agency must also be factored in. When you look at the rise, at least the fact that, most children are going to school at the elementary level, and at the secondary also, it's fairly high. Further, that the changing urban raises fundamental questions about spatial and social justice. Now, just very briefly, is COVID-19, which has been in the eye of, that's the pandemic storm. It has been harsh on disadvantaged communities and led to new marginalities. And there are questions around belongingness to the urban space of poor rural migrants. But the question is, did they really belong to the urban space even before COVID? What kinds of vulnerabilities and the way in which they have been treated actually post-2000 is also something to see whether this has just been compounded or not. Okay, so on this. Now, if you look, now let me just come to the main part of what I'm trying to argue. If you look at the settlements, now I'm looking primarily at Delhi, right? And if you look at Delhi, there is an official classification of settlements in Delhi, which is the plan. Now, so you have planned settlements and you have the non-planned. And among the non-planned, you have what are called unauthorized. Unauthorized settlements are those where they are not in planned areas, they're illegal, but people have bought those spaces, right? Those are unauthorized. And there are those who are regularized, unauthorized, and those which are the jhuggi, jhopdi, slums, etc. So you have the planned and the unplanned, okay, as far as it. Now, what is important is that only planned colonies were legal and had access to basic services such as water and electricity. So everything else, they were basic. And by 2000, barely 24% of Delhi's population resided in legal planned colonies. I'll just show you the table. So Heller says that, so depending on where you lived in Delhi, you had unequal rights to basic services which the normal citizen of India and resident of Delhi should have got. He calls this differentiated citizenship. And if we look at Soja, this would be, this would be spatial injustice, right? Now, so what happens? Now, if you are not entitled to the same services in different parts of Delhi, and if this had happened prior to 1990s, so these are unjust geographies which were officially in place prior to what we think is the neoliberal turn. Now, this is something that, this is the table. I don't know whether you can see the whole table, but this is type of settlement. This is the population, percentage, legality, and, for instance, service such as water supply. So if you look at this table, these are what are called jhuggi jhopris, which is the normally slums of bastis. This is their population, and this is illegal. They have no right to any of this. A lot of this is taken by, stealing, putting some things here and there. So that is the jhuggi jhopri clusters. Then you have certain areas which are slum designated, very small. I mean, it's this is the percentage of the population, and these are legal. So I'm basically looking at these. Then you have unauthorized colonies where, as I mentioned, they have bought the land, but it's not legal because it's not in the planned area. Then you have resettlement colonies. That is when these jhuggi jhopri hutments are demolished, then they are given alternate sites. Not everybody, those who have legal documents, those are called resettlement colonies. These are officially legal and planned, but in most of these, you don't get these basic rights. Then, of course, you have something called, you have the rural village. Then you have unauthorized colonies which are regularized. You have urban villages like, Munirka and all in Delhi. They have separate rules. And then you have planned colonies, right? These are the planned colonies. For instance, I stay in Vasant Kunj, or you're in Sarojini Nagar, Lodi Garden, Lodi Road, Chanakyapuri. All of these are planned colonies. Here, these are legal and planned, and water supply, electricity, and others are good. Now, basically, we have to see that this proportion of the population, we are just looking at these, and we are looking at the planned colleges. So I'm trying to say that this is privileged space, and this is disprivilege and lack of, excluded kind of groups. Okay. So from the early post-independence decades, Delhi has been a national aspirational space for rural migrants who then came to the city. There was demand for their labor in building the city and urban infrastructure as part of the development of the post-independent welfare development state, and as well as during the early phase of privatization and liberalization in 1980s and 1990s. In the subsequent just a minute, sorry. Sorry. So we are sorry, I've just jumped ahead. So now if I look at city spaces and schooling, so what is important is that depending on whether you're living in planned or unplanned, city spaces privilege. That is, they unequally benefit some children residing in planned and exclusive areas, and they disadvantage the majority in unplanned and unauthorized settlements. Okay, so what happened was in the 1970s and 80s, a lot of those who came to the capital to build the city, as I mentioned, or to look for jobs, etc., they lived in these jhuggis and jhopris, and those days there were some demolitions, for instance, at the time of emergency and something, but majority of these settlements were in the planned areas of Delhi. Okay. So if you look at now, so let me go back to this, the planned and exclusive areas before I look at the bastis. Now, a lot of, depending on where children are living, they are available, they have access to certain kinds of education. Now, if you look at the Kendriya Vidyalayas, or you look at even the what are called the government public school, like the Naval Public School, the Army Public School, etc. All of these are in the planned areas of Delhi, right? So that those who live in these areas have access to good quality education. But if you look at what I'm trying to argue is in the other areas, they are living in areas which do not have certain kinds of access to education. So in the 1970s and 80s, with the building of the city infrastructure, new airport, preparation for the Asian Games, some slums were demolished. That's what I'm trying to say. And early resettlements at that point were established for those who lost their dwellings. But the fact was that prior to 2000, the majority of these slums or juggi jhopdis were in the planned areas of Delhi, because as the city was being built, these juggi and jhopdis were being set up where people started to live. So and there was a network of schools in these areas. So what I'm trying to argue is that since they were in the city, in the planned areas of the city, many of these poor families were able to access schooling. So when I was talking to the families in Bhavana, what they said is they came to Delhi in the 70s and 80s in search of employment, in search of livelihoods, to look for labor or whatever it was. But they did find that there were some schools to which they slowly started sending their children. Here, accessibility of the schools was important. And so one was there were schools accessible, and there were aspirations to give their children an education. So you find that by 2000, and from the many juggi jhopdis, a lot of them then went to this Yamuna Pushta area, where they settled down for at least a generation or two. So until the early 2000s, these people whom I spoke to in Bhavana, they were residents of what was called the Yamuna Pushta, a large illegal settlement, slum or basti, on the banks of the Yamuna River. There were around 30,000 families there, first and second generation families, who came to Delhi in the 1970s and 1980s. They were displaced from various sites, and some of them themselves moved from different sites to ultimately coming to the Yamuna Pushta. So what happens in these migrant families is they often move from one place to another. They were engaged in a range of activities. They were auto rickshaw drivers. They were, in small business, small petty kind of business they were in, and a lot of them were. A lot of the women were involved in domestic service. So they were engaged in a lot of activities that serviced the city and its middle classes. While some non-literate parents had been able to give so the parents were non-literate, but by the next generation, they were slowly starting to give their children an education. And by 2000, even daughters were going to school, right? Now, because there were government schools in the planned area, because there were, certain facilities, and there were, tuition was free, certain supports were given, SC/ST students were given scholarships, uniforms were given, right? They were able to send their children to school. Okay, but by then, the government system itself had become quite stratified, quite deeply stratified, and then the public system also by 2000 was unable to provide education for majority of the population, right? And subsequently, and private English medium schools, there was only a very small proportion of schools, again, largely in the planned areas. And subsequent aspirations also led to the growth of school markets and low budget unrecognized schools, right, in the capital. The government school also system became increasingly stratified. And in fact, if you look at the Delhi government schools, by the 90s, you also have, special schools to give better quality education, model schools, etc. But what was important is that for these families in the Yamuna Pushta, there were schools because they were in the planned areas of Delhi. Yamuna Pushta was in the Delhi planned area. Oh, sorry. Now, yeah. Now, yeah. Now, post 2000, actually, what happens is there is a growing aspiration to make Delhi a world-class city. Like the global cities of London and Paris. And also there was the Commonwealth Games in 2010. There was a desire to make it attractive to global capital, etc. And in post 2000, though you had demolitions from 1990s, there were large-scale demolitions post 2000. And there was the pushing of populations to the periphery of the city. Not all were relocated, only a fraction of those demolitions were of those who were evicted, but actually, were able to get some, were entitled to space in these peripheries of the city, right? So only a fraction of those who are displaced were relocated. Yamuna Pushta, the families, those about 50, only half the families were then, and they moved to the Bhavana resettlement area, where they were given some space to make their homes, etc. So they are moving to the peripheries of the city. So I think between 2004 and 2007, about 30,000 households 30,000 families were evicted. There were a number of factors. One is, of course, as I mentioned, the desire to make it a world-class city. It was also, there was a very active role of the middle classes and residents' welfare associations, who raised a number of demands to shift the slums and clean up their neighborhoods. The poor, there were NGOs, but their voices were not heard post 2000. I mean, there was, it was a totally different kind of discourses around the capital. Judicial activism also was very important, saying that the city could not have encroachers, illegal residents. I mean, these were those who actually were building the city, providing service to its residents. But there was a growing, growing demands to remove them from the city and to beautify Delhi. So there was this evictions and displacement, and these families, those who had legal documents, then were pushed to the peripheries of the city. So barely a fraction of those who were evicted were relocated to the settlements on the periphery. So I think basically what I want to say is that there is this social spatial polarization, but these fault lines were laid down because of the system of settlements, the classification of settlements of Delhi, and subsequent post 2000, when there was this restructuring, it compounded spatial and educational inequalities. So this is what I wanted to show you. In the 1990s, you have all these juggi jhopadis all around Delhi, right? There are a huge number here. And the children from here, including from Bhavana, including from the Yamuna Pushta, were able to access schools, some of the government schools which were in their vicinity. Post 2000, you find that here is Bhavana. Here is Bhavana. So from here, and these are these dark triangles are the new resettlement areas on the peripheries of Delhi. And so you find that from the center of Delhi, they are pushed to the peripheries. And these are areas without any facilities. And when they reach there, there was nothing much over there. So this is the situation in the 1990s and 2000. So here, though they were living in jhuggi chopris, in difficult conditions, at least they had access to some kind of schooling, because the schools are in the plan. There's a network of schools in this planned area. But once they come here and they're pushed to the thing, these are on the peripheries of the city. And I will explain to you what happens there. So this is the changing landscape of the settlements. They're pushed from here to there. This is the resettlement colony in the early years. So the resident says, we are in the middle of nowhere. And this is also, so this is the world-class city. On the one hand, you have these resettlements. On the other hand, you have this, this is a gated community. This is the kind of, I'll just discuss primary school and over there. Yeah, so this is the Bhavana JJ colony as it is today. And so just some pictures for you to see. And this, I'll just come back to this in a while. So we are looking at this resettlement, Bhavana resettlement. It's 40 kilometers away from where they were staying earlier. It is socially produced because it is a result of the restructuring of Delhi to beautify Delhi. And it is located on the spatial margins, but it's also a social margin of the city. It's 48 kilometers from Yamuna Pushta. This is around 2004-05 that these demolitions happened. There was a struggle for livelihoods. 2005-07, as they say that, this site was like a jungle. There was nothing here. And there was a lot of fear for women and girls, especially. It was near the Bhavana village, but it was like a, absolutely, unsafe wasteland. It lacked infrastructure, basic amenities, even sewage, and only a dilapidated primary schools. This was not the earlier resettlements in the 1970s. That was the period of the welfare state. So there were some norms. So by 2020, when I spoke to them, this is what Bhavana colony had become. So in 15 years, they had more or less built something there. And this is the school post 2014, that is after the AAP government has come. Now, let me very briefly try to highlight what is the result of this kind of spatial urban restructuring that happens. So what has happened is when in Yamuna Pushta, majority of children were going to school, somewhere completing their secondary schooling, but with the shift in April or so, even those who were completing school had dropped out, about a 30%, there was dropout. There was only a dilapidated primary school there. Okay? Older children, those who were studying, were pulled out of school and they had to, take care of the family, enter work. And so there was lack of school. So even facilities of schooling, there was just a dilapidated primary school. It was a very unsafe area. There were rumors that girls were being raped and kidnapped, so girls were not sent to school. Some people persevered, and tried to, admit their children in this Bhavana village. But there, because they were staying in a jhuggi jhopdi, it was now called Bhavana Jhuggi Jhopdi Colony. But because it was jhuggi jhopdi still, and they were seen as Dalits and Muslims, so it was, they faced a lot of harassment. Admission was denied. So early struggles, there were a lot of strategies. Some people tried to send children home and brought them back after they sent children to villages, then brought them to their villages, brought them back when they had set up their homes, or they, tried their best to find some admission somewhere. So they, with a lot of aspirations, at least, so older girls, of course, were married off and all that, but at least for younger children, there were efforts to try and somehow ensure that they get some kind of education, and slowly the schools started coming. Now, there is, of course, under RT, there's a 25% EWS quota, but this is meaningless because on the periphery, there is no private schools also. Post 2000, post 2014, with the AAP government coming here, schools they've been much, because it came with, on the political slogan of education first, and hence there has been some better quality of schooling, etc., and some more opportunities for education. So by 2020, you find that a lot of children are now started going to school and staying on in school till class 10 and 11. But what is important is that when they were just evicted without notice, there was a huge dropout, and only few months earlier, parents who wanted to wanted their girls to complete schooling now pull them out, and their marriage, early marriage, etc., became important. Now, what about how? So this is 2020. So by the time I went in 2019, yeah, you found that families had again somehow, built that space into what you saw there as Bhavana. It's still called JJ Colony, Jhuggi Jhopdi Colony. The fact that it has Jhuggi Jhopdi in its title is a stigma, and I'm not sure why they have kept the Jhuggi Jhopdi there, because these are legal colonies. And in higher education, very few youth go on to higher education. One, lack of resources. Secondly, they are on the periphery. There's huge distance. They need to earn from the family, etc. And Delhi University is very far away from there. It's a 2-hour journey. And for girls, many girls have entered marriage. But there are aspirations for future education. Many young people, especially youth, male youth, go into correspondence courses. But what was interesting is that there is a college called Aditi Mahavidyalaya linked to Delhi University, which is just near, which is in Bhavana village. And because of the location, the spatial location of a girls' college within a few kilometers, where girls can go, not too far away, I found that a small proportion of the girls, maybe 3% was significant, had started to go to this Bhavana girls' college. And I did a lot of interviews with them. In fact, I found that their families, in their families, especially the mother, the intense desire to have at least one daughter educated, and the fact that it was close by, it was well located. You found that there are a small group of girls now, the first generation of Dalit Muslim girls were in college in 2019. I also met a few who had by 2020 had started going to Delhi University, Rajdhani College. And because, buses are free in Delhi, that's for the AAP government. So a few of them are going, but in all these families, it is only a proactive mother or sometimes a proactive father who is able to somehow ensure that, at least to some extent, that these girls, a few girls, at least one, is able to go. So that is something which was quite, but majority by class 10, 11, 12, they're out of thing. And the boys, again, this is an area where, because, Delhi, a lot of the polluted industries were shifted to this area. So there is not much opportunity for work, very low paying jobs. A person who's finished school will get only, say, it's called a manager, but gets some 5,000-6,000. So not much opportunities. Now, very briefly, what happened COVID and beyond? I had also gone back during COVID. Like we all know, in many parts of India, in most of India, COVID has been a very difficult experience there. It has sharpened inequalities, created new marginalities, and exposed institutional inadequacies. And it has been the prolonged closures, online schooling. We know all over, but here I could hear from the parents and from these girls the kind of enormous difficulties they faced because of COVID, online schooling. They were dropped out from school. Girls were had to get married, were forced to get married, and so on. And there were, of course, the usual and the fact that in these areas there was a lot of people moved back to their villages the moment the lockdown slightly lifted. They moved to their villages, and many didn't come back. So many children never came back to school, and those who were there They, some older children had to get out of school and help their parents to somehow have a living, so that in these areas there was no lockdown because people had to survive. So they were on the streets trying to sell some small, vegetables and some other tidbits, etc. The usual problem of mobile, not having enough mobile, not being able to recharge the mobile, the space is not adequate. So because of where they were living and how they were living, COVID affected them in certain ways. What then of the future? I think in 2019 there were aspirations and a lot of hope that we would that these girls, at least, they would look for work and they would move ahead. But by 2020, with COVID, this was very uncertain in terms of what would happen. Mothers actually said that we really can't afford this anymore. Our families are saying that get these girls married. So there's a lot of, and also the girls themselves were saying that even if we want to work, where do we go? Because we are at such a place where there are no opportunities and we will not be allowed to go any distance for our own education. So I think the point is that, of course, it's also important. This area did not see the kind of violence that some other poor settlements in Delhi, like the Northeast Delhi saw. That compounded the kind of problem that COVID brought. And in many cases, parents, especially of Muslim young girls, they were not allowed to, there were stronger patriarchal controls. They were not allowed to go back to school. And a lot of them were pleading with their teachers to somehow ensure that they could get back. So really what happens is that the whole generation, the kinds of shift that took place in education over a generation, and there was a kind of a, it was COVID and the kinds of problems that it created a lot of uncertainty as far as they were concerned. Also because employment and social mobility is so difficult in the spatial. So even when with great difficulty, one daughter, I mean, in the case of these daughters, are educated with great difficulties, what then of the future is also something to think about. And their location there really is a key, has been a key problem. So I think this is, there are of course other issues of, the online and the use of technology, the fact that children want the face-to-face schooling and all that, but that was all part at the time of COVID. So I think broadly, I think what I have been trying to do is really look at, what happens in the changing city with urban transformations, particularly when there is this this kind of complete restructuring of the city, which completely destroys large sections of the poor, and when they are pushed and to spaces of what are called relegation, what then happens to children's education? And we find that children's education actually suffers a great deal because of that. Even it is not that when they were living earlier in their juggi and jhopadis and all that they were given any good education, but because these schools were not too far away, because they lived in the planned city, they were able to access education. The moment they are pushed out from those areas to spaces where there are no facilities, they are on the periphery, these are spaces of relegation, then their vulnerability again is compounded. So I think it's important for us to really understand that, especially when we are talking about the right to education and the equal right even to higher levels of education, the changing urban compounds exclusion, while on the other hand, there are privilege and there are areas of privilege where you have good quality schooling and you have access to international schools, and these are all coming again, a lot of it on the periphery on the other side. So I think what I'm trying to argue is that spatial location is increasingly defining one's access to education, school, and even higher education, as I have tried. So that when we are talking about social justice and we are talking about those who, are disadvantaged, and in the case of those who are on the, those of the urban poor, it is not that they belonged to the city even before that, but they had a space in the city and they were able to try and access the city's resources there. But now that they have been pushed out to the peripheries, it is becoming really extremely difficult for them to access the resources of the city. So that when we are talking about socio-spatial justice, we are really talking about the equitable right of children to the city. And when we talk of equitable right of children to the city, we are saying that it is to the socially valued resources in the city. In terms of health and many other factors, but also education. That must also be kept in mind. And I think it's important to, try and understand urban transformations in different parts of the country, because the way it plays out may be different in different places. And we need to see how do different sections of what does this mean, especially for those who are poor and disadvantaged. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am.
I closed the.
Dr. Mosam Trivedi.
How do I close this?
Ma'am, stop sharing.
Okay. Yeah?
Yeah, now it's stop. So I'm sorry, I get lost my connection. I was just okay. So thank you very much, ma'am, for your interesting views on sociology of education, particularly how the educations before independent, after independent, and especially the past 30 years of the education's patterns will how change, and what are the urban sector have the role for it, the development of the cities. It doesn't mean the development of education is always be goes. It is always matter of the caste and minorities. So I hope my fellow colleagues are really very interested in this talk, and those who want to ask some questions, please feel free to ask question answer.
I see there are a couple of questions here. Yeah, see the data which I put was 2002, mainly because I was looking for, I wanted to know what was the nature of settlements, the class, planned, unplanned. So this data was there for 2002. I mean, I don't know whether there is the most recent data I don't have, but I wanted to make the point that by 2000 itself, you had a very divided city, a very segregated city, which had planned, unplanned settlements, etc. That's why I gave that. But I'm sure there is, and the implications of this is all part of the neoliberal urban agenda. And in Delhi, at least, it has resulted in the complete eviction. Though after I think 2010, 11, I think there was some that stay on these evictions, but the large-scale evictions happened I think around the late 1990s and 2000 to 2007. That was the majority of them. And this peripheral, somebody has written peripheralization happened in northwestern cities. Yeah, see, the thing is that the building of the cities, I think not only here, all over the world, does lead to the, to exclusion and eviction of large sections of poor populations. In different parts of, in Calcutta, of course, it is very different. But in Delhi, I think what I was also trying to say is there was that kind of great, so now, to make the city world class became a huge thing around 2000. And that was built into a kind of a public discourse. And it was like, so prior to that, there was a lot of concern about the poor, even including from the judiciary, and the NGOs were there. But post 2000, that there was this discourse about beautifying the city, throwing out people who were encroachers, etc. So this was the dynamic in Delhi. I think even in Mumbai it was like that. May not have been like that in many other parts of India. So what happened is those who were residents of the city then were, actually the court said these are encroachers in the city. There was also the big thing, they are Bangladeshi migrants. So a lot of efforts to push them out. And the middle classes and their residents' welfare associations, which are very active even today, they were also in the forefront of this. In fact, Sheila Dikshit's Bhagidari shared a whole program called Bhagidari, in which the middle class residents' welfare associations were brought in. So it created a larger discourse in which the voices of the poor were not really heard. And without any concern, because 2009 was right to education also. So without consideration of all that, they were not moved. Only 50% of them were able to. Now the rest, nobody knows what has happened to them. They're probably in other jhuggis, hutmans, again on the periphery. In fact, if you go to Bhavana, you do see a lot of these hutmans around. And that is the idea of the slum-free. That was also one big thing, that we must have a slum-free city. I'm just reading the chat box. Yeah. Okay.
Any other questions, please? Friends, please raise your questions if you have any, or any discussion, you want to make some correction also, you want to make some kind of statement also with regard to what you know about education and the slum education. Please feel free. It's a very interesting topic. You must be getting a lot of doubts, many questions. We'll have a debate, we'll have a discussion here.
I have a write-up on this, which I can send. And
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, we can
much, better worked out thing, because I'm not sure how much has been understood in this, because you have to, run through it very fast. But that's it. So I think the details will be in that.
Any more questions? I think I request Mosam to read out the questions, asked in the chat box.
Some of them I've already answered. Yeah, somebody wants me to send the present. I will. I've got that. I need this. If you can send me this Gmail, MKTEOTIA. Yeah, I will send that.
Yeah.
The other questions I've run through. And in fact, government housing programs did not help much. Yeah, that is true, because government housing is largely taken by middle classes rather than poor. They don't have much of that dwellings for poorer group. Yeah, I've got that. Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, Good evening, ma'am.
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you, ma'am. It was a very learning exercise for us. I'm a PhD student from Maulana Azad National
Ah.
Urdu University, and I'm working on online education school market. So my question is regarding in an urban space context, my fieldwork is Hyderabad. So what I am seeing here, a school for elite people have a proper school infrastructure with the international standards, but school for working class is not appropriate, mostly operating in residential building with lack of infrastructures, because from market perspective it is not profitable business for them. So what I frame argument on these experience ki, the encroachment of market forces into educational space is pushing the emergence of alternative supplementary educational systems such as edtech platform to address gaps in the urban education landscape. So what is your take on these arguments what I have framed?
You know, actually, the thing is that I mean, there is no doubt that there is enormous aspirations for education and English medium education, right? And I also mentioned a little bit, but these school markets, especially low-cost schools, etc., post 1990s, they have really spread. Post 2000, they have spread a lot, right? Now even in the in because there are the public private schools are expensive, but so most people can't afford them. So you have these low cost, unrecognized, a lot of them unrecognized kind of schools. It is now when you look at this area, the peripheral area where really they don't have much money. So these school markets are not there so much. Even these coaching classes and all much less, in those areas. But if I had spoken about the unauthorized colonies, like for instance, Sangam Vihar, which has about 20 lakh population, and it is unauthorized, unplanned. But people who own their little plots over there is a flourishing school market, online market, everything is flourishing there. Now, in these markets are unregulated. So there is nobody to put norms as to what it's functioning as a business. So the tragedy is that young people, their parents, they are looking for futures for their children, but because of the coming in of privatization and profit making, etc., these kinds of institutions without adequate infrastructure in single rooms. Coaching industry is, of course, huge. That's a different one. Coaching for these colleges, coaching for etc. Hyderabad and Andhra Pradesh has so much of it. But post 2000, post COVID, online schooling is really becoming a big thing. Online education is becoming a big thing. Ed technology is becoming a big thing. Like Byju's, as you know, was a huge profitable venture. But if you actually engage with people, they find that face-to-face education is far better than online. Online can be supplementary. But to have face-to-face education with good quality teachers, this is what people want. So I think it's important. I mean, I have got some things written. I have done some work on this low-cost schooling and education as business, and EPW and all. There are some articles. And also trying to show how powerful these private networks are that have these business. In fact, look at Byju's. They were really a powerful kind of thing. So that is at one. But post-COVID, what has happened with online and what is happening around that is an important area which you are looking at. Are you looking at schooling or post-schooling, or what is the online you're looking at?
Schooling, basically.
Sorry?
Schooling, post-schooling, K-12 education, particularly 9th, 10th,
Post-schooling
11th, 12th.
market. Yeah, so we need, actually, to tell you the truth, not much is known. Aspirations are there. People are accessing what kind of education and what futures they lead to. I think that kind of work needs to be done. So we can see that what happens to their aspirations and the kind of money that parents are putting in. So I think that's an important area to study. But
Thank
if
you,
you,
ma'am.
I mean, I have some things on private, low-cost private schooling. If you type my name, you might find it. Yeah, somebody has written, yeah, that the population is forced to leave, settle in the city, inequality. Yeah, no, I agree that, you know, there is large numbers who are coming, and especially post 2000, the role of the state is very minimal. You know, the kinds of facilities that are coming up are minimal. So because these facilities are not there, the private sector is coming in. In a lot of the Delhi's periphery, especially where not where the poorest migrants are, but where others are there, there's a lot of school markets are coming up. And this may be happening in most parts. Delhi model of education, actually what has happened is, as far as, I mean, there's a general, you know, that the coming of the Aam Aadmi Party has improved, they have given a focus to education. Yes, they have given a focus to publicly funded education. That is true. In this particular area, because this is a legal, it's a planned space. So the schools has been, there is an improvement in the facilities for schooling, and there's an and there is, I mean, greater access to education, though of course it is still not adequate. But what the Aam Aadmi Party is now doing is it's completely stratifying education. It's having schools of excellence, schools of this, that. So a system of education is becoming deeply stratified within it. So one has to see exactly, you know, there's no doubt they gave attention. And in this Bhavana area, I could see clearly that compared to earlier, there was the quality of facilities was much better. We spoke to the teachers and to the principal. There was a greater, you know, sort of, you felt that they were more involved in what was happening. There were parent-teacher meetings. And parents also said that because it was so bad earlier, that, you know, and the primary schools were under the MCD, which is the Bharatiya Janata Party led, and that hadn't improved. So the improvement in the middle and secondary schools was, you know, seen what the Aam Aadmi Party. So that model of education, it began in a certain way, but now there is this, you know, to create this islands of excellence in a publicly funded system becomes a serious problem, you know. So then within this, only some children will have access to it, and it will be those children coming from low middle classes largely, rather than from the thing. So that is a bit of a problem. There is also, you know, policies of merging schools and all that, and that also will create a problem for especially those who come from more vulnerable sections. You know, closing down schools, you know, because the number of children are much less, and children will be less because most of the bastis are thrown out from the center of the city. They are gone to the periphery. So that also results in the emptying out of schools in some areas. And these are where you have very good, you know, buildings, you have a lot of land around it. So I think that is a kind of issue there. So, yeah. Now that is interesting. Bhivani, to look at the impact. I would suggest you please just have a look at what's happening to education and schooling, because unless you know, where you're located makes a big difference.
May I share something, ma'am?
Yeah.
It's my personal view, not a question, but what I believe that as far the education system have so much gap between two classes, so I always feel like the education is one kind of education is class education, and the other kind of education is mass educations. So those who have access to educations, they are more marginalized. They are coming from the marginalized section. They people are from mass educations, and those who get a better education system, access a private and fully equipped educations in private schools or private institutions, they are kind of class educations, so they can compete more than the mass educations, so they have a better opportunity, better access to great jobs, and also they have some brain drain, we can say. Those are the peoples. And those who are coming from mass educations, we create this kind of people for the labor purpose.
No, I mean, broad, these are, of course, is very broad generalizations.
Yes,
because
ma'am.
each group, if you take mass, there is a range of groups in that. So one needs to see how, whether it's in, what are the kinds of intersectionalities between class, caste, gender, and class also, there are a range of, if you're looking at economic categories. So how does that play out? It's a complicated thing. And then even if you're looking at the middle classes, a lot of fractions, upper, middle, lower. And then you have the extremely affluent. So I think it's the fact that, yes, you experience disadvantage, exclusion, deprivation because of certain social and other factors. But in a range of ways, that's what I'm saying. It's a range of ways. As a girl, you will find it is different for you as compared to someone else, coming from a different, say, social class, or if one is coming from a marginalized, stigmatized, or a kind of a minority, right? So how do these factors play out? That I think one can do a much more complex way of looking at it. Broadly, yeah, this is okay. But how does it really play out? Because people come from a range of social, economic, cultural, and other thing. And I'm trying to say that where they're located is also important, right? Because, there was, whatever it was, the Bhawana families came as poor migrants. But by 2000, they were educating their children. Because where they lived, they had some access to some schooling, right? So that helped. But the moment you clear up the city, all their hopes are dashed and all that, and they have gone out. Now, whether this happened in some other city, I'm not sure. Other cities also have, but may have played out differently. So it is interesting to see how it has worked out, say in Hyderabad also, or many others, right? So I think one has to and do some really in-depth kind of work with families and with young people, because we must be able to highlight that there is a lot of aspirations, a lot of struggle, a lot of agency of these people, whether Dalit, minorities, etc. How are they actually trying to engage with the system, struggle with the system, which is not helping them that much, right? But if there is some policy, state policy, like in Delhi, the buses are free. Because the buses are free, these girls were saying, at least we can go to Delhi University and come back. Something. So the importance of the state and public to make things more public, more inclusive, that becomes important, right? So one has to see, like, if it is going this way, then the kinds of vulnerability of people will only increase. So one has to look at the role of the state, role of the market, look at where they are located, and look at various other factors. There's a whole dynamic of factors which actually influences what happens. Okay, so I think that one can look at it, because you all are in different places. You can do in-depth work, studies in that, even though they're not large scale, but in-depth studies to see what are the dynamics, what works, which may be different in somebody's in Bhiwani, it may be different, somebody's in some other place, may be slightly different. Overall, there may be some changes. And this may help us understand, both in terms of structures and agency, and the role of institutions, and the role of the state. And we may be able to say that, acha, this is how it goes or can.
Yes, thank you, ma'am. There is one question on chat box. Your ideas on ST population coming to urban areas for education. Do the slum population are studied?
Actually, there are very few of scheduled tribe here in this population. It was mainly Dalit and Muslim. So I think the proportion of STs in Delhi are small. And poor ST, also a small population only in Delhi. So there were no ST families in this. But yes, in many other parts, there must be a lot of the labor of migrants are coming from these communities. But these were mainly these two. Even the girls in college, the college-going girls were Dalit and Muslim. So because that Yamuna Pushta was predominantly these groups were there. So what I'm looking at is those from there, those who moved to the Bhavana settlement.
So, thank you very much, ma'am. I think there are no more questions, no more doubts about the lectures. So I thank you very much from bottom of my heart on behalf of the Research Committee for Sociology of Education. But there is a formal vote of thanks being offered by Dr. Mosam. So thank you very much. Thank you for accepting our invitation and giving a wonderful lecture. It's in fact, it's a very ongoing issue about we are also seeing many issues here in Hyderabad with regard to urban education, urban slums, and their education also. One of my students also has done some study for her MA project on this topic. So thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I request Dr. Mosam Trivedi to offer formal vote of thanks.
Acha, somebody's question, sorry. What is that? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think.
What is the question?
Yeah, there is only, ma'am, please take my question. What is the question? We are not able to see.
Please discuss a bit. I'm not sure which is that.
I think question.
This one, okay.
Ideas on
admission, coaching culture, traditional school, psychological and social effects of coaching culture on students. Well, I think you can see, I mean, you just have to look at the reports coming from Kota. You know that Kota is the coaching center, and I mean, apart from the suicides and all there, I think coaching gives a very narrow, the education is extremely narrow, exam oriented. So I think in terms of what you learn and understand, yes, it is all, I'm talking just generally, and because it is so competitive. So peer relations, I doubt you cannot build peer relations in such extreme, competitive and narrowly focused kind of thing. But I think, and teachers and pedagogy, I think this is an extremely important topic that you are planning because it's a kind of a, what should I say, like a battery, the battery of, lessons, and you're only focused on this. There are no other development. personality development, games, etc. All of which is important for young person, to grow up as a well-rounded personality and to be able to be a larger social person. Obviously, this is going to affect it. I think it's important to study it. First, do a reading of at least some of these coaching institutions. Quota, though, I read so many of these suicides when not able to take the strain of the coaching because they have to do simultaneously, I think, school also, and when they don't succeed. So I think it's an important thing, and curriculum in schools also. I have a student who did this for her. She looked at this coaching for the IITs, and I think this is when the school also then tries to tailor it. In fact, and sometimes you have it in school also. So ultimately, what is education? It raises the question, what is education? What does one want from education? And you can see that the most elite will not give their children this narrow kind of education. Okay, so I think it's an important area, important to see what happens to teachers. Teachers are supposed to be people who engage with their students and supposed to be larger than just, giving them capsules of whatever is required for the examination. So I think it will raise some very important questions about teachers and peers. I mean, peers are important to survive, and peers are important. I doubt someone in a coaching institute will have the kind of friendships that one can build, and very important. So I think that's what I think. I myself have not done too much, but one of my students, Shalini, had done on coaching. Okay. SM. Is that all right? What I said, it's just off the top of my head, but.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. So, with all respect, I'm really very grateful to ma'am to give her precious time to all of us. And I think this is the really very interactive session because so many participants are asking questions, and madam really very patiently give them all the answers. And I'm very thankful to all participants who are joined from wherever they are, from India or outside there. So, and I'm really very thankful to RC5 convener, Dr. Mohammed sir, who doing this wonderful job to every month. He organizes special lectures, and by this activity, we all meet online by this medium. Online medium. So thank you once again, all of you, and thank you.
Thank you to Professor Mohammed.
Thank you, ma'am. I thank Professor Maitreyi Chaudhary, President of Indian Sociological Society, that has been motivating us regularly. Personally, she's calling, messaging us. You call this particular professor, particular faculty is good, particular one is very appropriate on this topic. Regularly, she has been interacting with us, and in fact, I can say that she has been helping us in organizing these lectures very much, and you can see the difference in how Indian Sociological Society and different research committees are moving with full of academics and full of kind of interaction. So I take this opportunity to thank her and other functionaries of the Indian Sociological Society. Thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you for asking me. Thank you.
I personally thank you. This is the third time that you are accepting our invitation. You had given a wonderful lecture in our department also. And the second time you had given a wonderful lecture in the academic staff college. I mean, UGC at HRDC also, when Saeed organized the program. Then thirdly, in my SESI seminar, you were a speaker on, panel speaker on education. This is the fourth time. So thank you
you.
very much for counting us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I thank Dr. Mosam Trivedi. She has been helping her. In fact, I am troubling her regularly. Every time, whenever there is a lecture, I am calling her. You do this, you do this. She is accepting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mosam, and thank you, Professor Mohammed.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks to everybody.